Thank you. Right, so Germany then as now has a state church, which means that the church itself and the church leaders are actually civil servants. They are paid by the government, and as such then also their training is sponsored by the government and through the state universities. Right, so the theology faculties are in the major universities, and if you wanted to become a pastor in Germany, you would go to these major universities and study theology, right? And that was then as now, and that's where many of these debates were being fought out. But as I was doing research for my dissertation, which sort of turned into my first book, I started to see a lot of kind of focus around a couple of particular universities that became very interesting to me. And I wanted to go and look at this further for this new project that I'm talking about. And the two universities, one is a small university on a sleepy town up on the Baltic Sea called Greifswald, still a city only of about 50,000 or 60,000 people today. So it's a very small university. And the other one is, of course, the most famous university maybe in the world at that time, or most successful at that time, the University of Berlin. And around these two faculties developed a dynamic and interesting rivalry about the doctrines of Scripture, about who should be teaching the university. And this, because it was part of the state government, also very quickly escalated to questions about politics, questions about society, questions about the future of Germany and the future of Christianity within Germany. So I'm fascinated by how this kind of very localized, small, nitpicky kind of debates in theology began to escalate and become something much, much larger. So what I wanted to do was just give kind of an overview of this politicization and growth of this particular theological debate into a much, much larger thing, and what this ended up doing and changing as far as the shape of Germany, but also just in a sense the shape of the debate itself. All right, so that's just to get us going in the first place. So I tried to, using my incredible artistic abilities and the tools available from Microsoft Paint, to try to develop a schema. I will keep working through this and I'll try to explain it as we go. All right. So, but first, again, I'm a historian, so I have to keep going and pushing everything back. I can't get to the debate right away. So first of all, I need to talk about this school up in Greifswald, up on the north, on the Baltic Sea. Right? Theology had already for 50, 70 years been interacting with new debates, questioning some of the fundamental doctrines of Christianity, what it means to be a Christian, how it means to be a Christian. And so this had been around for a long time, and for the most part, at least in one of the provinces, the largest province of Germany called Prussia, their idea was to have blended faculties, to have faculties that had some liberal members and some conservative members and kind of allow them to duke it out within the faculties. But many of the more conservative students, or students more interested in a more traditional faith, then chose not to study at these Prussian universities if they could help it, or spend less time at Prussian universities. University students at this time used to bounce from college to college to college to college. And so they would go to places outside of Prussia, go into Saxony or go into Bavaria or down into Württemberg. And these were different areas. And so the church leaders are a little bit kind of concerned, why are we having this brain drain of many of these students to these other schools? And so one theologian, sort of the hero of the conservatives on this side, I'll show you his picture, Hermann Kramer. He wrote, this guy here on the right, my right, your left, he was a writer of one of the first Bible dictionaries, and at his time, very important, nobody reads him anymore. Right? But in any case, Hermann Kramer got together and got the idea with the Prussian cultural minister to go ahead and create a theology faculty that was exclusively conservative, to try to pull some of those students away from going to those other schools. Right? At the time, Greifswald had like 40 students in theology. And so there wasn't a whole lot of risk, and they started to do that. They started to allow Kramer to determine who he wanted to add to his faculty. He brings up a lot of the rising stars out of the more traditional and conservative schools. And very quickly, now, university students are just growing everywhere. Theology students are growing everywhere at that time. But very quickly, that faculty of 40 students jumps to about 320, 350 students. So it becomes one of the largest faculties in all of Germany. And so for the most part, the Prussian cultural minister is able to say, hey, this is a good thing. We did a good thing here. All right, so that's the creation of the Greifswald School. Over in Berlin, Berlin was one of these mixed faculties, had conservative members, had liberal members, but they had a new opening, and they decided to call one of the real rising stars in liberal theology, a guy by the name of Adolf Harnack. He's still just Harnack at this point. Those of you who study theology will hear of him as Adolf von Harnack. That comes a little bit later. But in any case, Adolf Harnack's this rising star in theology. He, in liberal theology, questioning the origins, going through and looking very systematically at the doctrines of the early church, trying to determine where and when and for what reasons the various doctrines were created. So he's actually a church historian and writes then this sort of long, systematic, many-volume church history, doctrinal history of the church. And he is, like I said, this rising star, but also a firebrand and a bit of kind of a controversial character. And so when the University of Berlin calls him to Berlin, all the conservative church leaders, and at this point the church is dominated by conservatives, all the conservative church leaders object. In fact, they try to block his hiring at Berlin. And this goes through, it actually happens at the very time that the first Kaiser, the first emperor of Germany, is dying, and his son already has throat cancer, so he's about to die as well, and his grandson then is going to ascend the throne, and there's this kind of question, what it's going to be the nature of these ones. So the church is really pushing hard, really trying to use whatever influence it can to try to stop the university faculty from hiring this liberal theologian. And it doesn't work. They call him anyway. Okay. So the church kind of says, all right, let's go back. We'll lick our wounds. We'll fight another day. But we'll definitely be watching Harnack, making sure he doesn't do anything that disrupts the order, and particularly the conservative dominance in the church at this time. Okay, so in a totally different province, totally different area, a guy who's learned from some of these liberal theologians stands up at the baptism of a child, right? And if you've ever seen like the Godfather movies, you know that at the baptism you say the Apostles' Creed. And at the baptism of a child refuses to say the Apostles' Creed. And he says, I simply cannot hold to a doctrine that says that Jesus was born from a virgin birth, that he was conceived by the Holy Spirit. I can't adhere to these doctrines anymore, so I refuse to say it in front of the church. And the church defrocked him, right? Said, okay, well then you can't be a pastor anymore. And a whole bunch of young students, right? For whatever reason, students tend to be firebrands and radicals, go rushing in Berlin, right? Totally different corner of the empire, rushing into Berlin to their new sort of hotshot faculty member saying, you have to do something about this. This guy was just fired and we're afraid we're never going to be able to do anything about it. Now Harnack's an academic and he's like, I'm not a politician. I'm not really interested in that. I don't want to get involved in church politics, so I'm not going to do anything about that. But I will put forward a lecture series about the Apostles' Creed. So he issues out he offers these sort of summer special lectures. A bunch of people come, and he's saying all kinds of things that kind of question the early origin of the Apostles' Creed. He basically says it's not a first century document, so from the generation of the apostles. It's actually a 5th century document coming already after the fights of the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian Creed and all those things, right? So it's actually a simplification of these more complex creeds meant to bring heretics back into the church. This is his argument, right? It's a pretty kind of narrow academic argument about where the origin of the Apostles' Creed came from. But, like I said, all of these conservative church leaders have been watching for this, and they hear that he's going to do it, and because he's afraid that the rumors are going to go out faster than his words and his thoughts, he publishes his lectures. It's just a short little pamphlet. It's really, it's something that can be digested in just one sitting. And so there's this huge uproar. He's questioning the Apostles' Creed. He's questioning the early belief in the virgin birth, the early belief in the Holy Spirit's conception of Jesus. He's questioning all of these things that we hold dear to our church. So a number of Christian leaders start to get upset, at which point, this is where we come back and we get back to this guy, Hermann Kramer. Hermann Kramer is hearing all these people upset about this idea, hearing all these people upset about what's going on. And he writes his own paper in reply, where he goes systematically, point by point, through Harnack's argument, basically saying, this is probably not the case, this is probably not the case, we can find early origins of this idea, we can find early origins of this idea, basically going through and in the end saying, Harnack might be right that the actual formulation of the Apostles' Creed as we have it now is a later development, but all of the theology does come from the generation of the apostles. So he keeps it academic. They're arguing about when do these things happen, what does it mean, what does it mean, how does this play out theologically, not questioning really anything else about kind of at least not initially or directly questioning anything about the nature of salvation or Christology or those kinds of things, right? And so Kramer writes this very academic response, and he writes actually at the very beginning of this, hey, all of you conservatives out there, all of you guys who are wanting somebody to shut down Harnack, let me do it. Stop flipping out, stop getting wild. This is an academic problem that can be dealt with in a very academic way. And so they're going to be represented by this first chart that I have up here. Right? And the first chart basically says we've got a small local chart. You have conservatives, they're the yellow group. You have liberals, they're the blue group. And they agree actually on a fairly considerable portion of ideas. The center of their argument, however, that's the yellow dot and the blue dot, just keep those in mind, are separate from each other. They do have very real disagreements, very important disagreements. But they're not disagreements that can't be dealt with in a more sort of staid academic measure that over time will eventually resolve itself, right? Which is why, for instance, none of you guys today are actually reading these articles anymore, because they have been kind of resolved in the academic world. But that's not good enough for the church leaders. Right? This is Adolf Harnack. Early on, he'll grow up, his hair will get wilder, he'll become much more famous. He becomes kind of the most famous public academic in Germany during his lifetime. Hermann Kramer is going to die. This is all taking place in 1892. He's going to die in 1906. Very famous and celebrated during his lifetime, but like I said, subsequent history has not been as friendly towards Kramer as Harnack. Any of you guys wanting to go on in seminary or theology, you're all going to have to read Harnack at some point. All right. So, like I said, though, very quickly we start to see new groups getting mobilized, angry about what's going on, particularly the church leaders, the leaders at the level of the bishops and the deacons and the sort of and pastors as well. And they have a lot of say in this state church. It's a very hierarchical church structure. There's a group called the Oberkirchenrat, right, sort of the church council. It's like 9 people from each of the sort of local provinces within this larger state church. And then they have a group called the Synod, which is sort of in every 6 years they have a big election and they have parties that represent different viewpoints, theological viewpoints. They have these elections and they kind of determine basic doctrines and ideas and directions of the church. So in any case, the conservatives, the group that supports Hermann Kramer. And they're called the Positive Union. And positive in this sense means, as opposed to being critical and destructive, they are positive and constructive towards their interpretation of the scriptures. If you want to know what their theology looks like, read my first book. Right, so these positive theologians are part of a church party called the Positive Union, which is basically going through and trying to say, hey, let's find doctrines that will affirm the traditions of the church that will still be able to play and work in modern Germany. Right? They're not quite like the fundamentalists in the United States. I'll get to those guys a little bit later. Well, the Positive Union gets really worked up. They were the ones that had objected to Harnack getting a job there in Berlin in the first place. So they start really mobilizing their groups. In fact, they're going to demand a special synod election that's going to respond specifically to these questions about the Apostles' Creed. They get all kinds of they basically engage then in a much more political rhetoric. They're publishing, they have all kinds of local, sort of church newspapers and magazines, kind of like Christianity Today. They're publishing all kinds of articles in these about how terrible Harnack is and what an existential threat he is for the church in Germany. And so this becomes a much bigger issue. And the central core issue that they have is the church ought to have the ultimate veto power over who gets to elect or who gets to appoint theological chairs. Right? It would be kind of like taking at Spring Arbor, taking the power of appointing the theology faculty away from the theology faculty itself, and then instead asking the Free Methodist Church to appoint faculty members. Right? So this is what the church is demanding and asking, or at least the Positive Union is asking for. Naturally, not everybody in the church agrees entirely with them. Like I said, many of these people have learned from liberal theologians. And so they begin to also call their groups together. They publish in their newspapers and magazines like the Christliche Welt and others, all of these things about how important it is for academic freedom to exist so that the church doesn't become parochial and backwards and obscurantist, which is proverbial and backwards. All right. And so they're calling for academic freedom, and they're saying, no, it's absolutely important for the church to step outside of this issue. And so this ends up being, for church elections, a fairly ugly election. The Positive Union wins overwhelmingly, and they're dominating the church party, but they don't quite have that actual legislative and official power to change who gets to do this. So they send very sharply worded letters to the emperor saying the church needs to be in charge, or at least have total veto power over any faculty members. If we had veto power, we would have never had Harnack. If we never had Harnack, we would never have had this controversy. If we had never had this controversy, everybody would be good Christians, which is problematic. All right. So by this point now, we're moving outside of the realm of just this comfortable theological language, this small minor debate that's basically pamphlets going back and forth that could be resolved and probably ignored. And it's actually, again, those champions of the more conservative viewpoint that are the ones that are first to sort of get out there and say, we need to make this a much bigger issue. We need to mobilize politically and engage in our political structures. So here I have a new chart, right? So we have our conservative faculty members. They're still in yellow. They're part of the Positive Union. They agree with the Positive Union, so they are included within the Positive Union. Or within this sort of conservative church party. We have the liberal church parties over on the left that include the liberal faculty members. They still are at least all of one mind that the state church ought to exist, that the church ought to be connected to the state government. This is very important. They still agree that Germany should be fundamentally a Christian empire and argued and decided as a Christian empire. And so they're still agreeing on some things, but now the question's gotten much bigger. Now the question is no longer what's the meaning of this theological doctrines and these small theological debates. Now the question is a much bigger one. Who should determine who is allowed to teach the pastorate? Is this a church issue, or is it a state issue? Is it a university issue? Should pastors actually have, or should university professors actually have academic freedom? Or is there a point at which should they be doctrinally bound, that they can't question certain things, right? So this is a much larger debate, a debate that has much further standing and wide, expansive reckoning and results. All right, this, by the way, is, he's the head of the Positive Union Church Political Party. I'm going to come back to him, Adolf Stöcker. This other guy that you have, Willibald Beischlag, he's a theologian at Halle. He's head of the Middle Party. I just needed to have some parallel and balance. He's not going to come as important in the next round. So let me get to this guy, Adolf Stöcker. Adolf Stöcker is a true German patriot. He kind of came of age at the time where the German Empire united. They had a series of wars in the 1860s, culminating in a victory over France, at which point the King of Prussia was crowned German Emperor in Versailles. And this was this great thing. He felt so motivated by it that he went and he became an army chaplain in occupied France. Right? This is how much of a German he is. And he's writing all this stuff about how Germany is going to become this new sending, this bright city on a hill for the rest of the world, and that the German unification and politics is exactly what is needed to bring a new age to the Protestant church. He's then his preaching that he's writing and his letters that he's writing are powerful enough and effective enough that it grabs the attention of the emperor in Berlin, who says, hey, I like this guy, right? He's supporting the role of the emperor, so I'm going to call him to Berlin. So he's called to Berlin to be one of the 4 court preachers. It's a huge, huge church. It's called the cathedral. Probably shouldn't be, but it's called the cathedral in Berlin. And there's 4 preachers, and they kind of rotate once a month. They do the preaching. And he quickly becomes probably the most celebrated of these preachers. People love to hear him. He becomes known as Father Stücker. And one of the things that he's really famous for, what he's really considerate and careful about, is he's really concerned about the growing number of poor people in industrialized Germany, and that they're turning their back on Christianity. And so particularly Stücker's big thing is he's really, really angry and fearful about the growth of socialism as a political and sort of worldview ideology in Germany. She spends a lot of time talking about socialism, and anything that's going to undermine the authority of the church is basically playing Germany, or basically handing Germany straight over to the socialists. So he's all about that there needs to be a unity and authority of the church, that this needs to be a uniform sort of vision and proclamation on behalf of the church. I'll get into why he's also an even more complex character, right? So he's caring about poor people, that's his sort of driving focus, but he thinks that the answer to that is more authority. Well, Stücker starts to realize, Stücker is also somebody who's gotten involved in politics. In fact, he has a seat, he's a member of parliament at the same time as being a court preacher. He has his own political party called the Christian Social Party, right? Not socialist, but social on behalf of the poor. And he joins the Christian Social Party for the most part to the conservatives in Germany, although the conservatives don't have as strong a feeling about the church as Stücker does, or as strong a feeling about the poor as Stücker does. So Stücker doesn't really fit well, but that's the group that he tends to sort of vote with, because his party's pretty small. Well, he has a newspaper that is, for the most part, on his side, that views the world as he does. And this is a newspaper called the Cross newspaper, right? So it would say it had a big picture of the German Iron Cross right in the center of it. It's actually called the New Prussian newspaper, Neue Preußische Zeitung, but it's almost always called the Kreuzzeitung, right? This Cross newspaper. And the Kreuzzeitung was all about trying to create this vision of a Germany through the media of, right, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but media can be biased and polarized. Trying to give a picture of a polarized media, this is a polarized media that's trying to give a picture of an authoritarian Christian Germany becoming triumphant around the world. And so they begin to report on an almost daily basis about the comings and goings of this debate about the Apostles' Creed. Right? They encourage readers of their newspaper to write in and talk about to write in and send in basically editorials about how important it is to object to Harnack's interpretation, how dangerous this is for Germany. And so you can go through in 1892, 1893, sort of as this debate's playing out, and see one article after another about how Harnack is undermining Germany. Right? So now it's becoming this thing that's part of this larger political vision of a conservative, authoritarian state rallied around sort of crown and cross. And so it's part of this, again, much bigger thing. And because Stücker is doing this, it's also beginning to agitate then the press on the left. Now, the left, for the most part, are not part of the theological world, right? So this larger black circle, they really have no interest whatsoever, for the most part, in the church. In fact, most of the editorial boards and most of the owners of these newspapers are Jews. So they really don't have a whole lot of interest in Christian theology whatsoever, but they do see that Stücker is advocating this close union of authoritarian government with a very powerful church. And so they begin to realize that one of the ways that they can advance their message is to advance Harnack's message. So now Harnack himself is kind of politically moderate. He likes the emperor and tends to sort of side with him, although he's more kind of liberal, classically liberal in his politics. And so Harnack really has no interest whatsoever in this larger mobilization. But pretty soon he's getting defenders from really strange places. Places like the very liberal Nationalzeitung, national newspaper. There's also even support for Harnack coming out of socialist newspapers that are saying, right, here we see even Christian theologians are abandoning any kind of belief in that Christianity has any real origins, and so therefore we need to support this, and by supporting Harnack, you're supporting weakening the church, which will lead ultimately to the rise of the worker state. Well, Stucker's not one to really back down when those kinds of things are coming up, and he's been doing this for a while. And increasingly, and this is the time where he's really developing it, he starts to levy more and more attacks against the Jewish press, and about how Jews are trying to use back avenues of media and business ownership to control Germany, to oppress the working class. And so he begins to side more and more with a growing group of anti-Semites within Germany. In fact, it's Adolf Stucker's Christian Social Party is the first party that actually has like seats in parliament that is advocating an explicitly anti-Semitic worldview, right? Because he sees these Jewish people as trying to mess with Christian theology, all as part of this conspiracy, as he sees it, of Jews working either in business or in the Socialist Party to overthrow and destroy the Germany that he loves. Right? So now this small, again, local theological debate has now gotten to a much, much larger situation where it's asking this kind of question of, does Christianity have a fundamental role in Germany? Which up until this point, everybody would have, well, not everybody, but the vast majority of people would have said, sure. But now there's real people asking this kind of question, well, maybe not, or there shouldn't be, and there's now more fodder given to that particular side and that particular worldview. So by taking this out and expanding the circle of people who are arguing, right? And so I have my third sort of envisionment of this. And if you look at the press, the conservative press on the left, many of them don't really have anything to do with the theologians or with the debates or anything, but notice that their circle doesn't even cross over into the other side, right? Just as the theological, or just as the press arguments over on the right doesn't even cross over, and the center of the argument is moving further and further away. Now, there is a resolution, and actually it's a very Solomonic resolution to this problem, right? Because the emperor and the cultural minister realize that they have a church that is very, very angry, but that because they tend to be conservative is essential to maintaining their coalition of control, because they also don't want the socialists to rise up. And so they come up with a resolution. And the resolution is this: the church will not have veto power over who gets to have a seat in a theology faculty. But what they will do is, because Berlin has become so dominated by this figure, Adolf Harnack, who's this liberal theologian, they will add a new seat of theology, so basically an endowed chair, so to speak, in Berlin, for a conservative scholar. And the very first person they ask is Hermann Kramer. And Kramer says, I've already spent so much time working and making this conservative faculty up in Greifswald. Please, I can't leave this. Then they go to Kramer's very good friend, who I haven't brought into the story, Martin Kahler, who you should all read because he's amazing. And he also says, I can't do it. I need to be this sort of conservative weight in Halle, which is the same place where that other guy, Willibald Beischlag, was working. I need to kind of balance them out. So then the cultural minister's desperate, because there's only so many people who have the prestige that they can kind of go toe-to-toe with somebody like Harnack. So they return back to Greifswald, and they ask Hermann Kramer's closest friend and confidant, a guy by the name of Adolf Schlatter, another amazing theologian. And Adolf Schlatter finally acquiesces, because basically the cultural minister himself is going to his face and saying, if you don't do this, I have to quit, because this is the only way I can achieve peace. And so Adolf Schlatter says, fine, I'll do this. He spends then the next 6 years in Berlin, hates it, eventually moves away, but they replace him with another conservative scholar. And they begin to do this at other universities. In Bonn and in Marburg, smaller faculties that tended to be more liberal, they added an explicitly conservative faculty member, right? So this is kind of a creative way to make sure that everybody's kind of happy, except actually for the most part that really liberal press that really wasn't concerned about the theology debates anyway. So they come up with a great name for these new faculty chairs. They call them Strafprofessoren, or punishment professors. So basically, we're going to go and we're going to punish your faculty for being free-thinking and of approaching these things in a scholarly way by giving you this kind of backwards-looking traditional faculty member onto the faculty. And so all of those faculty members have to fight against oftentimes a very hostile public as well as a very hostile faculty. Right? So what do I get? Oh, sorry, that's the Kaiser at this time, so still is a young man. That's the cultural minister, the guy who looks like a friendly Amish guy over on the right, Friedrich Althoff. So I want to get to the conclusions or why this is a big deal, right? Because I was trying to think, right? We have these kinds of debates that come out from time to time that quickly sort of start in the church, generate in the church, but then become these sort of larger public things. Trying to come up with a couple of examples, and I don't know if I came up with one I was super happy with. But in any case, just from kind of the outset, it would look like those conservative theologians who wanted to protect the traditional doctrines of the church were the winners. They were the ones who got a new faculty member placed at Berlin. They got new faculty members at other places. They were affirmed, whereas there was no liberal faculty member, for instance, put into Greifswald, at least not initially. So it kind of seemed like they won, right? They also, what else was I going to say? They also begin to, but at the same time that they're doing this, the Kaiser actually demotes Stöcker. So this is the new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who's actually very conservative otherwise, but he demotes Stöcker because he's become too much of an embarrassment. So he's actually taken out of his position as court preacher. He's stripped of his power within the church synod. And he takes all of those conservative church leaders in the high the high committee and removes them and replaces them with far more moderate voices. So the church leadership becomes more moderate, but actually more than anything else, refuses to deal with doctrinal issues anymore. They just deal with kind of practices within the church rather than actually trying to go up and face these larger doctrinal issues that are going on. So what ends up happening is that the church, dealing with the crises of modernity, of industrialization, of new thinking and new knowledge, doesn't have an effective body by which to arbitrate these things and by which to think about these things. And so the church can't really respond. They try to keep a fairly broad umbrella, which the German church still is to this day, with very conservative members, very liberal members, kind of all underneath the larger church structure. But it begins to eventually split Christianity and into different voices at the very time where all of these crises are kind of happening one after the other. And of course, the great crisis that's coming, World War I, which is going to lead then to a time of turmoil, the rise of the Nazi Party, etc. That leaves a church that for the most part says, we don't get involved in really hot themes and topics. We just kind of stand aside and let the government do what it's supposed to do. Right, so this sort of short-term gain that seemed to be gathered by the church bringing and very quickly sort of expanding the circles and the spheres that are interested in this theological debate very quickly begins to be a long-term detriment towards the fruitful interplay of ideas and the sort of the strong affirmation of the traditional doctrines of the church. Right? And so this is my final point, right? These are the middle points, right? That the early debate becomes more and more polarized. It becomes more and more polarized as the effect and the value and the ramifications of the debate become greater and greater. They become more and more polarized, right? Now, in Germany, like I said, that sort of Solomonic resolution and the enforcement of the authority of the church, of the state over the authority of the church, for the most part, kind of decouples the theological debates within Germany. There will, of course, be the future big debate about whether Germans should be whether Christians can be Nazis or not. That's going to rise again, but that's going to be done mostly in the realm of academics. This sort of larger social debate, or the ability to have this larger social debate, kind of ends there. Right? But it will pick up other places, right? I sort of say that's kind of the end of the fundamentalist modernist divide within Germany. It's the beginning of the fundamentalist modernist divide in the United States, in England, and other places that are taking these same ideas that are coming out of Germany and beginning to question what's our actual process and purpose. I'm not going to go into a whole lot in editorializing about that, but I just simply wanted to kind of say, right, here's this situation that we get to look at that's separated from our own hot button issues and our own hot topics, and we're able to kind of look at that and see, okay, when we start to take these kind of, when we start to invest these sometimes more local issues and arguments into larger and larger arguments and larger things, that it oftentimes spins out of our hands and out of our control, and then takes on ramifications that and results that maybe aren't necessarily what we wanted, right? So that I have this term, right, that it becomes a kind of collateral damage, right? So that was my thoughts for today. I'm happy to take any questions or ideas that you have. If you want to ask me about anything that I've experienced in sabbatical, that's fine. David?
Would you just tell us, you've heard these things, this is all you've heard these things?
This is a summation of a lot of what I'm doing, yes.
In other words, since the book, this is what you've been doing.
Right, exactly. So I mean, this grows out of my last project, which was looking at the theology of this kind of conservative group. This is looking at this particular point where it was kind of most in the public eye, and so I'm looking at that last decade, about 1892 to about 1902. So, yes?
So this is a counterfactual question, kind of speculation, but if the impulse to escalate the debate, run out of control, I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any speculation about what might have been the most factor in the first of these debate about the process? That would have been long term.
Right. It gets too counterfactual for me to sum. I certainly don't want to get to the point of saying like, oh, well, the church would have been this in 20 years. I think had the debate stayed at that kind of more the level of the theologians, if it would have stayed academic, which was the issue on the part of, if it had stayed academic on the part of the university leaders, there would have been an opportunity for the more traditional leaning sort of theological leaders of the church to be able to maintain their prestige in other aspects of church leadership, right? Basically, they put all their eggs into one basket and simply said, this is going to be our make or break moment. This is going to be our litmus test. And it lives and dies exactly on this question of particularly the virgin birth and the Apostles' Creed. But I don't know if that conflict wasn't at some point going to come anyhow. So I can't say that they didn't, but certainly very quickly they also made a false calculation. They expected Wilhelm II to be more conservative theologically than he was. Initially, he had actually been a great supporter of Adolf Stücker. And he turned out to be far more pragmatic in terms of church doctrines and church issues. And so he wasn't their friend, and very quickly stripped them of power. Rich?
And wasn't that what Kramer said that originally, right? He said, leave this to me to sort out.
Right.
That was kind of the advice he wanted to follow.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I tend to defer to Kramer on that point. He's pretty smart. So. Yes?
All right, this is really marvelous. Thank you for your work. Where's it going to be published?
No idea. I'm still a long ways away. I'm still in the process of kind of data collection. So I was able to spend, right, one of the coolest things for historians is to go into the archives and actually like grab a hold and touch these documents that you know these people that you've been studying touch, right? Which yeah, Hermann Kramer, right? Nobody knows who he is anymore, but it's still, you get to see it. You have to deal with their awful penmanship because, of course, they didn't have typewriters at this time, and so you have to kind of work through that. I'm still, this process of doing this talk today was very helpful for me trying to figure out what's the long-term, because I have all these different kind of ideas rattling around in my head. This helps give it a little bit of scope and direction.
It's so rich that there's so much to engage with. You know, you want to go back to all the little points and look at them and understand them and see how it all fits together.
Right. And of course, and the thing is I'm also, being an American, I'm bringing all of my American impulses and ideas into my interpretation of German history. And I think actually in this situation it can be a real advantage, because the Americans in the early 20th century, there was this fundamentalist modernist split where the churches and cultures really split so that certain Christians just refused to interact with culture as a whole anymore. Basically became like the Amish without the coffee table books, I think I once heard it described. Right? The sort of totally separated themselves from culture, and whereas the modernists engaged with culture, became the mainline churches, right, and became sort of social gospel people, right, and this split shapes and continues to shape our theology in the United States today. And a little bit my kind of question is, why did this not happen in Germany? Because a lot of the very ideas and impulses that caused the fundamentalist modernist debate in America were coming out of Germany. And so that's what kind of got me sparked and interested in this in the first place. And this seems to be the decade where it could have gone in the direction of the American model.
Don't you think the obvious reason is you got an established church? I mean, that's the elephant in the room that makes all the difference. You got the Kaiser.
Possibly, right? The state-church connections is possibly the case. But you have that fundamentalist modernist debate even in very hierarchical churches in the United States, though. So certainly the Christian pluralism in the United States, and the denominational pluralism in the United States, is a huge social difference, right? As well as just the more populist culture in politics anyhow. Yes. But but there is this kind of time where it looked like the church was at least ramping up to say, hey, look, we've got our University of Greifswald, we have our conservative leadership, we have our conservative magazines and newspapers, but instead of them just saying, let's create a separate culture and we just won't interact with them like they did in the United States, they did try to engage in this realm of the political, and that is different. Yeah. Good. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention.